On the night Marcus turned 34, he was sitting alone in his car in front of a gas station with $4.11 in his bank account. Not because he had been careless. Not because he hadn't tried. He had tried harder than anyone he knew. He sat there with the engine off because he didn't want to waste gas. The heater had stopped working 2 weeks earlier. He pulled his jacket tighter and stared at the steering wheel as if it owed him an answer. He thought about calling his mother. Then he remembered that the week before she had asked if he was eating properly, and he had said yes, and that had been a lie. He didn't cry that night. The tears had run out around the 7th month of the worst year of his life. What he felt now was something quieter and heavier, the specific weight of a man beginning to believe that the life he had imagined for himself might never have been meant for him. He took a folded sheet of paper out of the glove compartment. He had been carrying it for 3 years. It was a business plan he had handwritten late at night, back when he still believed everything was possible. The edges were soft from being handled so often. Some of the ink had smudged. He read it anyway. Every word. Then he folded it back up, but this time he put it in his pocket, not in the glove compartment. He started the car with what little fuel remained and drove home. That small decision, pocket instead of glove compartment, was the beginning of everything. Marcus grew up in a part of Sao Paulo people described with a familiar kind of weariness. The kind of neighborhood where ambition felt like a personal offense to everyone around you. Where wanting more was treated as a betrayal of your roots. His father left when Marcus was 9. Not dramatically. He just stopped coming home one random Tuesday, and that was it. His mother worked 2 jobs and the money still didn't stretch to the end of the month. Marcus learned early what a woman's face looks like when she is exhausted but refuses to stop. He saw it every morning at the kitchen table. She never complained. That almost made it harder to watch. He was a decent student. Not exceptional. He didn't have time to be exceptional. He was working in a warehouse at 16, handing almost everything he earned to his mother without her having to ask. He got into a private college on a partial scholarship and worked to pay the rest. He graduated with a degree in business administration, a heavy debt on his back, and absolute certainty that his real life was finally about to begin. It wasn't. He spent 3 years in a job that paid just enough to keep him from leaving. He pitched his business idea to 11 different people with money. 9 were polite. 2 laughed. Not cruelly, almost sympathetically, which somehow felt worse. He lost that job in a round of layoffs. Then he lost his apartment. He moved into a room in a house with 4 other people in a bathroom with no hot water after 7 in the morning. He set his alarm for 5:40 every day just to shower like a normal person. And still, he kept working on the plan. Not because he was sure it would work, but because stopping felt like agreeing with everyone who doubted him, and he wasn't ready to do that. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. Marcus knew that exhaustion well when winter came again. It lived behind his eyes. It made simple things feel like negotiations. Getting out of bed, eating, answering when his mother called. He had applied to 42 jobs in 4 months. He had a spreadsheet. He knew it was 42 because one night he couldn't sleep and scrolled through the rows, company names, dates, and the single word he had typed in the status column more than 30 times. No. His friend Leandro kept telling him to let go of the business idea. Leandro meant well. He had a stable job, a decent apartment, a weekend routine that looked comfortable from the outside. He would sit across from Marcus at the bar where they split an appetizer to save money and say, "Man, at some point you have to be realistic." Marcus never argued. He stayed quiet. That silence was doing a lot of work. Because part of him, a growing and increasingly loud part, was starting to agree with Leandro. He would lie awake at night running numbers that never added up. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing something that hadn't moved an inch toward him. He thought about people his age who had made peace with the ordinary and seemed fine. Genuinely fine. He wondered if ambition was just a well-dressed version of fear. Fear of being nobody. Fear of admitting that maybe he wasn't as capable as he had always believed. There was a night, a cold, very quiet Thursday in July, when he almost deleted the business plan from his computer. The cursor hovered over the file. He stared at it for a long time. He closed the laptop instead of deleting it. He didn't feel triumphant, just tired. The next morning he woke up, the file was still there, he made coffee and opened the document again. He still didn't know why. Some part of him simply wasn't finished. Even when his mind had run out of reasons to continue, there was something underneath the reasons that hadn't given up. He couldn't explain it. He stopped trying to explain it and just followed it. That quiet, stubborn something was the most important thing he had. He just didn't know it yet. In August, Marcus took a temporary data entry job at a small logistics company. It paid minimum wage. He sat in a gray cubicle, typed numbers into spreadsheets for 8 hours a day, told himself it was temporary, and tried to believe it. The office smelled like a place that never opened its windows. The walls were beige. The machine coffee was bad but free, and Marcus drank 3 cups a day, not because he liked it, but because he needed something that felt like a small privilege. No one there knew he carried a folded business plan in his pocket. No one asked. He typed, checked, sent, started over. It was the kind of job that gives you too much time to think, and Marcus had learned that too much time to think, during that period of his life, was dangerous. So he worked fast, more carefully than the job required. Not out of ambition, just because it was the only thing he could control at that moment. The owner of the company was a woman named Patricia Mora. She showed up 3 mornings a week, always early, always with her own coffee in a black thermos. She walked through the space with short, attentive steps, like someone who had built the place brick by brick and still checked the walls occasionally just to make sure they were standing. She didn't talk much to temporary workers. Marcus didn't expect her to. But one Tuesday afternoon, he stayed late. No one had asked him to. There was no overtime. There was just a batch of entries that was incomplete, and Marcus couldn't leave something unfinished when completion was 40 minutes away. It was a trait that had sometimes slowed him down in life. That afternoon, it changed everything. Patricia walked down the hallway with her coat over her arm, ready to leave. She stopped, took 2 steps back, stood at the entrance of his cubicle and looked at his screen. She asked why he was still there. He explained, without drama, without trying to seem dedicated. He just told the truth. He didn't like leaving things half done. She looked at the work on the screen for a few seconds. Nodded once, the kind of nod that isn't praise, but is recognition, and sometimes recognition is worth more, and continued walking. Marcus went back to his spreadsheets. He didn't wait for anything to happen. That was exactly what he had learned to do during that period, act without expecting a return. He was tired of acting to impress. He started acting because it was who he was when no one was watching. 2 days later, on Thursday morning, Patricia stopped by his cubicle before he even finished his first coffee. She asked what he really did, what his background was, what he had done before. He told her, briefly, without turning it into a pitch, without the slightly desperate tone of someone always trying to convince. He had stopped pitching to people who hadn't asked. He just answered honestly, looking at her as if it were a normal conversation between 2 adults. She listened without interrupting, stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "Come to my office next Thursday." It wasn't a warm invitation. There was no smile, just a sentence from a woman who didn't waste words. But Marcus felt something move in his chest, not excitement exactly, not the kind of euphoria he had felt before that always preceded disappointment. It was something calmer, like when you've been in a dark room for a long time and someone opens a small window. The light that comes in isn't enough to brighten everything, but it's enough to remind you that light exists. The following Thursday he went. He brought the business plan. She hadn't asked for it, but he brought it anyway, not out of boldness, but because that document was the truest thing he had, and if there was ever a moment to put his truth on the table, it was that one. Patricia read while he sat across from her. It took longer than he expected. He stayed quiet the entire time, not filling the silence with unnecessary explanations, which in itself was a form of maturity he hadn't had 2 years earlier. When she finished, she asked 3 questions. They weren't easy ones. They were the kind that reveal whether someone truly understands what they built or just memorized what they wrote. He answered honestly, including the parts where the honest answer was, "I'm not sure yet," and, "That's something I still need to figure out." She stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You've thought about this in a way I never have, and I've been in this industry for 16 years. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a check. Just an observation from a woman who had built something real from absolute zero, said to a man trying to do the same. And maybe that's why it mattered so much, because it wasn't kindness. It was evaluation. Marcus went home that night and, for the first time in a long while, didn't open the plan to revise it. He just sat with it closed on the kitchen table, his palm resting on top. Nothing around him had changed. The room was still small. The bank account was still tight. The road ahead was still long and uncertain. But there was a difference in his chest he couldn't fully name. Someone had read what he wrote, looked at him, and not looked away. Sometimes that's it. Not the big investment. Not the opportunity that fixes everything at once. Just a pair of eyes that sees what you see, and holds your gaze without blinking. And sometimes that's enough for a man to decide to keep going. Patricia didn't invest money. What she did was open a door, and Marcus understood, as he walked out of her office, that stepping through it depended entirely on him. There was no safety net on the other side. Just space. And space, he had learned, is both opportunity and responsibility. She introduced him to 3 people in her circle the following week. She did it simply, without ceremony, with the kind of direct introduction that says more about the credibility of the person making it than any exaggerated praise ever could. Just, this is Marcus. He's sharp. He's worth talking to. 3 sentences. Marcus carried them for weeks. The first person owned a co-working space downtown. She offered him access on nights and weekends in exchange for a small data organization task she needed help with. It wasn't glamorous, but it was an address. A desk somewhere that wasn't the corner of the kitchen in the tiny room he rented. It was the difference between working like someone trying to survive and working like someone trying to build, and that difference, even if only psychological, mattered more than he expected. The second person needed someone for a small consulting job in an area Marcus partly understood. It paid little, demanded a lot. He accepted without negotiating, not out of desperation, but because he knew it wasn't the time to negotiate value. It was time to prove there was value to negotiate. He delivered more than he was hired to deliver. Not performatively, not to impress, simply because when you've spent years without a real chance to show what you're capable of, the first real chance becomes fuel. The third person wasn't immediately useful. The conversation was polite and brief and led nowhere concrete at the time. Marcus thanked him with the same care he showed the other 2, sent a follow-up email 2 days later, and moved on without expectation. He had learned the hard way that some doors only open months after you knock, and that how you say goodbye to someone who can't help you now says everything about who you'll be when they can. That third person called 7 months later. But that comes later. Marcus began living in 2 shifts. During the day, he did odd jobs and freelance work that paid the basics. At night and on weekends, he built. The co-working space became his private office after 6 p.m. He arrived with a packed meal, stayed until the building closed, took the last bus home with heavy eyes and a mind still processing. There was nothing romantic about it. It was tiring in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived it. Not the heroic exhaustion of movies. The ordinary, persistent exhaustion that shows up every morning before the alarm and asks if you're sure you want to continue. Marcus answered by getting up. There was a 4-month stretch later that year when it felt like nothing was working again. The first client he had landed on his own disappeared without explanation, just stopped answering emails. Marcus spent days trying to figure out what he had done wrong and eventually concluded maybe it was nothing. Sometimes things just don't continue. That realization didn't comfort him, but it freed him from searching for blame that might not exist. A promising partnership with someone he met at the co-working space fell apart. They wrote 2 documents together, had 3 energetic meetings, and then the other man simply lost interest and moved on to another idea, the natural inconsistency of someone who hasn't found his thread yet. Then came the mistake. In a proposal for a new client, Marcus made a calculation error that went unnoticed until the presentation meeting. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make the financial projections look poorly grounded in front of exactly the people he wanted to impress. He realized it when one of them pointed it out politely but firmly. That night was hard. He sat alone in the empty co-working space staring at the screen for a long time. In the morning, he wrote an email. No excuses. No elaborate justifications. He owned the mistake precisely, attached the corrected version with detailed calculations, and asked for a second meeting if they were still interested. He said he understood if they weren't. They replied the same day. They wanted the second meeting. Not because they were nice. Not out of pity. But because the way Marcus handled the error said something about him the original proposal hadn't. Anyone can present well when things go smoothly. Few know how to fail with integrity. And integrity, in business, is rare enough to stand out. He closed that client 3 weeks later. He learned that way. Not in flashes of inspiration. Not in dramatic turning points. In slow, sometimes painful cycles of mistake, correction, adjustment, and quiet stubbornness. Each month taught something the previous month had prepared him to receive. He was getting better not because he was more talented, but because he was accumulating the only kind of knowledge that has no shortcut, the kind that comes from having truly failed and choosing to continue anyway. The temporary job ended in October. This time he didn't panic. He had 2 clients paying modest amounts. Too small to call security. But real, concrete, money that came in because he had delivered something valuable. Leandro called one Friday night and asked how things were going. Marcus told the truth without dressing it up. It's hard, but it's moving. Leandro paused, then said, "You sound different." Marcus realized he was. Not because he had arrived anywhere. Not because the money was good or life had become easy, it hadn't. But he had spent enough time inside difficulty to stop fearing it the same way. The struggle still weighed on him. But it was no longer a surprise. It was no longer proof that something was wrong with him. He finally understood that difficulty wasn't the opposite of progress. Many times, it was exactly what progress felt like on the inside before it had a name. And in that quiet understanding, without celebration or audience, Marcus crossed the most important line of his journey, not the line of success, but the line beyond which there is no returning to the version of yourself who doubts whether you deserve to try. 3 years after that night at the gas station, Marcus signed the lease for a small office downtown. He signed with the same pen he used to write notes on his business plan. He didn't do it intentionally. He only noticed after, when he slipped the pen into his pocket and felt its familiar weight. He paused for a second, then folded the copy of the lease, thanked the broker, and climbed the stairs to see the empty space for the first time as its tenant. It wasn't big. There was room for a desk, 2 chairs for visitors, a window overlooking a busy street, and a corner where he placed a plant on the first day. He bought the plant before buying any furniture. He wanted the place to feel alive before it felt functional. He didn't throw a party. Didn't invite anyone to celebrate. He arrived earlier than necessary on the first day, sat on the cold floor against the wall in the still empty office, and stayed silent for a while he couldn't measure. He wasn't trying to absorb a grand moment. Just letting reality settle. Sometimes the things you've waited for arrive with a quiet that disorients you. You expect fanfare and instead what comes is a deep, almost strange calm, as if the body knows before the mind that this is real and stable and won't disappear by morning. The company wasn't famous. It hadn't been featured anywhere. It didn't have a modern glass office or designer chairs startups love to photograph. It had 6 steady clients, 2 part-time employees, a recent graduate Marcus hired because he saw in her the same quiet hunger he recognized in himself, and an older man laid off after 20 years at the same job who needed someone willing to bet on him. Marcus bet on both. The company's reputation was built entirely on the quality of the work and the way he treated people. There was no marketing strategy behind it. Just the natural consequence of a man who had learned the hard way that the only currency that doesn't depreciate is trust. Every client came through a referral. Every referral was the result of someone being treated with respect and receiving more than expected. That third person Patricia had introduced, the one who hadn't been immediately useful, called 7 months later with a contract that became the company's first real leap forward. It wasn't luck. It was the direct result of a well-handled goodbye on an afternoon when Marcus had nothing to gain from being kind and chose to be kind anyway. Patricia stopped by the office one Wednesday afternoon without notice. She liked to see things as they really were, not as people arrange them when they know someone important is coming. She looked around slowly. At the plant. At the 2 employees working quietly. At Marcus. Good, she said. No drama. No speech. Just that word, spoken by someone who didn't waste vocabulary. It was one of the best conversations he had that year. Leandro showed up one Saturday morning with 2 coffees from the bakery on the corner. He sat in the visitor's chair, looked around with a smile that was half pride and half something harder to name. Maybe a mix of genuine joy and the slightly uncomfortable awareness that he had once told his friend to be realistic when his friend needed the opposite. They talked for hours. Not about the company or the future. Just about old stories and inside jokes. The kind of conversation that only happens between people who have known each other so long they no longer need to prove anything. At the door, Leandro paused. I was wrong when I told you to be realistic, he said. You weren't wrong, Marcus replied. You were being honest about what you saw. In you. Marcus thought for a second. I was being honest about what couldn't be seen yet. Leandro nodded and left. Marcus called his mother that afternoon. She asked if he was okay. He said he was. She asked if he was eating. He said yes. And this time it wasn't a lie. She said she was proud. He thanked her. She said she loved him. He said it back. After they hung up, Marcus sat alone in the office as the late afternoon light filtered through the window. He took the folded paper from his pocket, the business plan. The edges still soft, the ink still slightly smudged. He didn't open it. He placed it slowly in the center of his desk, as if it deserved a place of honor but no longer needed to be consulted. Because what was written on that paper and what existed around him in that small office with a plant, 2 employees, 6 clients, and a window facing a noisy street, were finally the same thing. And that, after everything, was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what he had promised himself that night at the gas station, with $4.11 in his account and the engine off to save fuel. Not fame, not fortune, not recognition, just the quiet, concrete proof that he was capable. That he always had been.